Okay. Yeah, so we want to quickly do rounds of introductions from people, especially the ones who haven't spoken here yet.
Cool, yeah. I'm Adrian. I'm one of the co-founders of Anoma. And we do intents and abstractions beyond your wildest dreams, man.
Hi, I'm Illia, co-founder of Frontier, and we're aggregating, abstracting, and we're going to try to deliver the best user experience you can have.
Hey everyone, my name is Liesl. I'm one of the co-founders of Essential, and we're building end-to-end-based infrastructure, including basically a universal DSL for chain abstraction.
Hi everybody, I'm Sreeram, founder of EigenLayer. EigenLayer is a mechanism which allows anybody to stake ETH and other tokens to secure all kinds of services we call actively validated services. Really excited to be here.
All right. I mean, we've had a couple of different possible directions to take this talk in, but maybe we could talk a little bit from like where do you see where a project that you work on fit in this world of chain abstraction?
Yeah, that's not. I think my take is that like the world is going to be full of heterogeneous trust models. I think like we're not going to live in this world where there's one global security model, so we must figure out abstractions that allow users to specify the security models or trust zones that they care about, right? Like, if we're here in Denver and we pay things in Denver, it makes no sense to have global consensus over these things, but it'd still be nice if my sort of interface kind of roams in the same way that mobile phones kind of roam, right? Like, I can take a phone from Europe to the US, and it still works against the same underlying protocols. And in blockchains, it's like, no, buy a new fucking phone and start from scratch, set it all up again. This is like clearly not a tenable model long term. So I think sort of like also what you mentioned earlier, a lot of this will evolve into applications abstracting this sort of complexity of chains away and users just defining in code to some extent what kind of settlement models, what kind of settlement guarantees people they care about. So right, like I may be happy to like transfer money here to like pay for coffee, but when I want to trade, I don't know, some Bitcoin, I may want to do this in the global decentralized system. When I want to trade stocks in New York, I'm willing to do like the official New York Stock Exchange chain. But hopefully as a user, I don't have to install new apps for all of these things.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, on our side, we kind of think from a lot from the product side and from how do we enable developers to have these experiences where their users don't need to think about this. And so the core piece that kind of we're releasing in months and it's out for people to build now is this idea that you should have one account that you can interact with every chain, with every application, kind of smart contract around there. And then around that, like what is the whole infrastructure, what are all the pieces that need to tie them together, from settlement guarantees to experience to gas to kind of all these pieces, and how do we make it easy for developers to build that, to maintain that as some of the underlying things keep changing, because this is kind of the protocols keep changing as well. So I think that like for us, that's kind of the core kind of mindset shift, I would say, is like, hey, instead of right now, like people launching applications and they're choosing a chain and they like either choosing because VCs told them or because they hope they can attract the users of that chain, but like changing that mindset to like actually you can attract all users, you can have kind of access to everyone, and like you can have liquidity and all the coordination happening using some of the protocols like Anoma and others. And the experience for you is the same. The experience is kind of single account, single model. So that's kind of what we're really pushing for.
Nice. Yeah, at Essential, I think one of the cool things we're thinking about is, if you think about it, users have always, in a way, interacted with blockchains via intents, in the sense that the user says, all right, this is what I want to be done, and then some other third party says, all right, this is how we're going to do it, and there's an additional party that says, okay, now I'm actually going to be the one to do this. And the disconnect there happens when the user is not able to express like fully, this is what I want, or the party that's saying this is how we're going to do it is actually like self-interested or only sort of drawing the user's liquidity to one like specific backend where most benefits whoever has created that transaction for the user. So what we're doing is kind of figuring out, all right, how do you abstract away even further within that flow so that the user can still just say, this is what I want done, but this third party that's saying, this is how we're going to do it, doesn't just have the power to dictate, like, this is the best way to do it, but the power to actually execute on that on behalf of the user. And in the case where, like, you're looking at that purely from a transaction perspective, there's this delta between, what this third party says I can do for you, and then what actually ends up happening on chain. So what we're tackling at Essential is figuring out how do you remove that delta, and how do you make sure that the solution that's proposed to a user is actually what they end up getting without that additional execution risk that happens between the point of transaction and the point of settlement. So yeah, that's sort of the high-level overview.
Awesome. From our viewpoint, when you think about chain abstraction, you can only abstract things that are easily parameterized. So imagine there are like hundreds of chains, each of them have like their own arbitrary trust models. Then what is the right abstraction to convey this to the user? It's actually pretty complicated. Because each user has to say like, I need this chain, or I prefer A, B, C, D chain, but not E, F, G, H, I, J, K chain. All these kinds of very non-fungible expressions. So our view is, or our role in this whole ecosystem is to abstract security, abstract trust models. So if you're building, let's say, a bunch of different chains on EigenLayer, each of the chains can have a measurable amount of economic security attached to it. And this measurable amount of economic security, imagine there's a common $10 billion pool on EigenLayer and you have like 100 services. Each service or chain can ask for a certain amount of economic security from EigenLayer and has the rights to uniquely slash and redistribute funds in case the service or chain breaks fidelity. And so what this means is fundamentally to the users of that chain, as long as the net transaction volume that was happening in the chain within some challenge period is less than the amount staked, they are actually operating under unconditional economic security. Which means basically like either their transactions go through and they get what they were promised, or if their promise is broken, they'll be able to slash and redistribute and acquire the same amount of insurance relative to the cost of the transactions that they were actually undergoing. So this, we think, is a fundamental unlock to now abstractions that can now be built on top. Because security is now abstracted and fungible. I have a measurement mechanism for what is enough security. Is it 30 nodes, is it 50 nodes, and so on, but instead here we convert everything into pure economic security, and you can actually allocate economic security as a unit. And when you're operating through like one of these interfaces, which are universal aggregators across all the chains, you may be saying, hey, I'm doing this transaction across these 3 chains, and the transaction's value is $10,000. Make sure that whatever security mechanism underlies these things actually has cover at greater than $10,000. And now I'm unconditionally covered related to all the actions that happen underneath. So that's our role. Our role is to abstract security itself as a commodity, so then you can actually have chains that consume security as a commodity, and then that propagates upstream to users who can then express very specific preferences relative to these actions.
Okay. So maybe a little bit of a spicier question, which is, how will what you're building interoperate with what other people are building both on this panel and just in general?
You mean will not interoperate? That's my favorite version of the question.
Or not interoperate, exactly. How are you a self-contained universe unto yourself that nothing else, we don't have Slack, so. how can you build what are the parts of the system that you feel like you need to plug into that are like probably most important for like success?
I think from our side, Anoma is a protocol, right? Like this is mostly, it's designed as a way for developers and users to have sort of a standardized API that solvers can plug into, where you say, well, I have an intent that wants to go from A to B, and I don't care how this gets settled. I just care that like I get from A to B under some assumptions. Anoma makes very little assumptions on where it's actually deployed. You can deploy Anoma to Ethereum, you can deploy Anoma to Near, you can deploy Anoma as an EigenLayer chain. Anoma really doesn't care that much about the analytic security model. This is more for the user to choose.
But this is confusing because aren't you a blockchain?
There also happens to be a blockchain, but you don't have to use that specific blockchain if you don't really want that specific security model.
Everybody needs a blockchain, Zaki, you know that.
Yes. In the end, I think like this really comes down to individual users will pick security models, and I think I'm not yet certain that we really know what the security model landscape is looking like. I can see a world in 10 years where my parents won't give a shit about like economic security. They'll want a chain run by their local government, and that's it, right? Like because most people are like very happy with physical security, and this is sort of the closest analogy that I think the real world has to security models. So I think the jury is still out on what sort of security models people will actually want in like the next 5 to 10 years.
You're saying instead of economic security, you want security with guns.
Yeah, so I think it's
That's the highest level of slashing.
I mean, you do.
EigenLayer support that?
I think it's a very reasonable security layer. It's like, I live in Switzerland, I like Switzerland, I mostly trust Switzerland. Like, I'm to a large extent I trust Swiss security and like adherence to rules more than I trust like 99% of the chains. Like, this is a better security model. I'd be very happy if the Swiss government runs me a blockchain.
Yeah, so on our side, I mean, we see kind of lots of different, like, you know, layers of the cake that pretty much all together compose into different experiences. And so that's why we're working with EigenLayer on, you know, fast finality. We have, you know, working with Polygon on aggregation, you know, for ZK proofs, offering data availability for rollups. We will, you know, open up the kind of intents for under account aggregation as we're actually executing. So the idea is like at every layer of stack, first of all, there should be options, and then you should be able to compose with everything else around that. And we have, for example, decentralized front-ends that right now already run with also rollups and some other chains and offer kind of fully, you know, decentralized experience to access all the applications without actually touching near when you're actually interacting with them, right? So the idea is like at every layer you have kind of optionality and you have tooling that is decentralized and opens up kind of new use cases. And so like for us, the broader vision is like how do we bring everything into self-sovereignty? How do we really enable this kind of experience that everybody can leverage? How do we, you know, unify and aggregate security? How do we unify and aggregate accounts? How do we unify and aggregate user experiences? Kind of at every level, kind of offer that tooling to developers to build better applications.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I also want to shout out the good people at Frontier and everyone else involved in the cake standardization working group to answer this exact question. You know, a lot of us are building really exciting but quite different things, and being able to figure out how we stop fragmentation from breaching the abstraction layer is going to be like one of the most important questions I think of this week and maybe this year. But on the level of Essential specifically, and Interrupt, like one of the most important things we're doing on the high level is making sure that like regardless of what system the user wants to interact with or knows that they're interacting with, that they're able to do that through like the same interfaces via intent-based, constraint-based programming language that's extracted away from the user via various like front ends or wallets, but that ultimately there's interoperability like throughout the space in the sense that whatever a user wants to be able to express can be like translated into a language that is understandable across the stack and across the framework. So whether that is then an intent or a constraint that is being fulfilled on our essential protocol or on any other protocol, that these will be able to like specify that and have full access to like the entire cross-chain space. And I suppose there's like an additional level of abstracting like underneath different chains with some of the stuff that we're doing with basically like building an executionless VM that allows for like direct settlement of intents via constraints. But that's a much deeper conversation. So the amount of time that we've got left, so I'll pass it to Sreeram.
EigenLayer is just a security zone, so and it's built on Ethereum. Okay. And built on Ethereum, why is this important? It's important because when you have multiple trust zones which are moving value around, if you don't have a common trust zone, you're going to be limited in the amount of economic value you can unconditionally correctly settle. So imagine there are 10 chains, and each of these 10 chains have some amount of stake associated with them. They're all on disparate, separate zones. Then when you interoperate across these chains, you can never move value which is greater than the amount of stake across these chains. Because if you try to move value which is greater than the amount of stake, then you will be, you may not be secure if you just take this purely unconditional secure model. Whereas if you had something like, a common settlement zone like Ethereum, and where all these different chains settle, and if something goes wrong, people can raise fraud proofs, and if nobody raises a fraud proof for a certain period, you can assume that whatever was stated was actually correct. Now you can start moving value which is much higher than the amount of stake available. I think this is a very, very, very important property. Imagine you want to put one of the goals of our whole space here is in bringing, all, let's say, things like real world assets into blockchains. I want to bring a $1 trillion bond into a blockchain. And I have whatever $10 million security is simply insufficient. When you have common settlement zones which can actually perceive and verify the accuracy of these claims, if you're willing to wait, you can actually transport an infinite amount of value unconditionally securely. And that's why we think like aggregation around a common trust zone is important, and we look around and what that zone is, and it's pretty clear that is Ethereum. So so that's one place we don't interrupt, right? Is Ethereum as the settlement zone that we narrowed it down to. And we've written papers, for example, on multi-chain trust aggregation. Can you get stake from 10 chains and together form a stronger basis? There are lots of problems. These zones can desequence. Like one of the zones can fork, and then now you're left with like a security model which is broken. When you want to write a settlement across 10 zones, you have to make sure that you are writing these fraud proofs and validity proofs and ZK proofs across n zones. Makes it very difficult. Already, we don't have proper working systems on one chain, so it's a much harder push to get it working consistently correctly across all these chains. So all of these drive us to, that's one cut, which is Ethereum is the settlement zone on top of which we can now build this substrate of further economic security to move value around at a much faster pace than can be supported by the native settlement apps. So that's the boundary of. So on top of this, staking, now you can start building arbitrary things, and so that's what we think about.
Okay, so we brought up the topic of settlement. I guess we've got 5 minutes left, and we're supposed to talk about settlement layers. So, but I'll ask 2 questions. What is a settlement zone, or like what is settlement? Is it a blockchain? And is it Ethereum or is it Circle?
Yes.
What is settlement? I mean, settlement is all about state, right? Like, where do you trust your state to be securely stored and securely transition from sort of state A to state B? And I think this, like, where you want settlement to happen, this is a very fundamentally local choice. Like, I think some people you can probably tell by now, I'm very, like, local first. Like, I think some people are very happy for their security zone to be their village. Because like they've known these people for the last like 50 years, this is the fundamental security zone that they trust. So I think this is where they will want to be settled, because this is sort of the social consensus that they trust. If you live in Argentina, you may not trust the government's economic policies as much, and you're much more worried about censorship and things like this. So in that case, you may want to go for like a globally decentralized thing, right? So I think settlement really are like, what is the settlement chain is in the eye of the beholder, and everyone will have a very different answer to what they care about. And I think it's kind of unworldly to assume that we can define a global settlement system that everyone in the world will agree to. This is sort of akin to the discussion on like, we don't have a one world government for roughly the same reasons, because different people will have different requirements from the system that they trust with their state. And it's probably going to be circular. But that's sort of a different discussion, sadly.
I mean, I think the way I think of settlement is that some specific set of guarantees that this transition will not be broken. And so, and because of this, you can now go and do something in the real world, you can deliver goods, you can, have a party. And so, to kind of, indeed, like, settlement is in the eyes of the beholder, and so, like, but, the eyes of the beholder, kind of way easier to judge something like, for example, Bitcoin, even though it can fork and somebody potentially is mining 51% fork for the past 4 years and gonna like present it right now and roll back everything that happened, right? That is in the realm of possibility, but we still kind of trust the current thing. And so that's why it is important to understand the eye of the beholder in the settlement state. But at the same time, you have a set of guarantees around like, well, to roll this back, somebody needed to spend this much money, this much energy, this much time, this much resources, and so that guarantee is also allowing you to like probably the payment I did for my coffee, probably nobody will go and like evil fork this chain, and so. I think where ZK is interesting adds to this, and like for me that was, as I saw ZK kind of actually becoming production, is that you can now have something that I can prove to you that this has happened, and you don't need to have, billions of dollars of like financial security for the proof of that it's happened. Now you still need like data availability, you still need like a bunch of pieces and kind of data information propagation, all kinds of like stuff. But that itself enables really interesting new things where even if Circle wants to roll something back, if we do have ZK proofs, for example, it is like now becoming a very kind of contested type of thing where, especially if the ZK proofs are like cross-reference. Imagine like Ethereum ZK proof is posted on here, ZK proof posted on Cosmos and Anoma and Agoric and everywhere. And so now like to roll back, you kind of need to roll back the whole Web3. And I think that will be really interesting to see as this kind of security aggregation unification happening. That you can have indeed local settlement. It's like, hey, I executed this transaction, here's the ZK proof, I shared it with my village, everybody's like, cool. And then you also throw it, post it in one of the global blockchains, and then they all interlinked. And so in 1 hour, of propagation, or hopefully in 1 second of propagation, you like rolling this back will require, all of the market cap of every chain, plus lots of engineering to actually happen.
Actually, the engineering is probably the bigger cost.
Exactly.
Settlement, yeah. I guess like the way I conceptualize it is by breaking it down into sort of two components. One being like fulfillment, and the other finality. Like you were saying, on the one hand, making sure like, all right, this isn't going to be rolled back. That's the finality component. But the other component is fulfillment, which like if you bring it sort of back into the real world, it's like, has my package been delivered to my house? Like, yes, this has been fulfilled. And from a user perspective, like the fulfillment is really the most important thing. Obviously, like finality is important, but what the user is looking for is like, has this outcome that I have asked for actually been achieved? And the way we're focusing on doing that is by actually sort of removing like the gap between like fulfillment from the solver level, like, okay, this is the best solution, and actual fulfillment as an on-chain inclusion. So this solution has actually been executed. And the delta between the proposed outcome and the actual on-chain outcome is where I see like the sort of most interesting conversations about settlement in the chain abstraction context, I think stemming from and something that we all need to be discussing a lot more. But I see the clock's running, so I'm gonna leave you to it.
I'll say something quick. A settlement zone is what you are referencing for if there's a canonical ledger of record for an asset. How do you derive it? If it's relative to some zone, that's what we call the settlement zone. There's a canonical ledger of record for the asset. That's the settlement zone. And as much as I appreciate the bottom-up, community computer ethos that Cosmos pioneered, I don't see community computers. I see functionality computers. Right now, if I look around in Cosmos, I don't see anybody trusting their local government or anything like that. I see people using different chains for different functionalities. The problem that happens when you have chains that are functionalities and you're taking trust assumptions on each of these functionalities, when you compose across these different chains, you get the worst of the trust assumption across all these different functionalities. That's what happens when you interoperate the community computer ethos with the composable computation ethos that crypto is building. So my sovereignty is capriciousness from a third-party point of view. I can do whatever, I'll roll back, I'll do this, I'll do that. Then you should not compose with other things without giving rigid guarantees on what you're actually agreeing to. All we are saying when we're agreeing to a settlement layer is what is the set of common things that you're agreeing to when you're interoperating. If you don't want to interoperate, you should be sovereign. That's the right answer. If you want to interoperate to the extent that you want to interoperate with people who don't want to take a counterparty trust assumption on you, which is what the whole point of crypto is, then we need to understand what are architectures that will actually empower you to do that. So that's why we think there is to build global systems of coordination, to build systems to redeem some of the problems that we're seeing in the world today where we don't have a global view of what is the right composition layer for global finance, for global coordination. That's what we think Ethereum and EigenLayer's aspirations are. I didn't answer the question about circle, tactically.
Well, we're out of time, and thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Is there a-